Museum Decolonization. In the opening scenes of the Marvel epic Black Panther, Eric Killmonger, our antagonist, infiltrates the British Museum, shattering a glass case, killing the curator, and making off with valuable artifacts of the Wakandan culture. To anyone familiar with the history of museums and their role in colonialism, this scene was particularly resonant, as Killmonger, representing the disenfranchisement and cultural loss of the African diaspora, reclaimed the artifacts of an unconquered African civilization. Museums, as we are learning, were central to the project of colonialism and the time period in which many important museums in the United States were formed and began collecting, coincides with what many view as the period in which Native American removal and dispossession was culminated. Practices in anthropology reduced Native cultures to museum specimens, severing the link between cultural artifacts and their living cultural context. Native peoples were portrayed as dying out, timeless remnants of a prior human existence. Indigenous youth were forced into assimilationist Indian schools, and reservation land dwindled with the passage of the Dawes Act. Central to the project of decolonization, then, is telling the truth of what happened to indigenous peoples historically, centering their voices and worldviews, and recognizing the conditions under which Western museums acquired their collections and shaped their narratives. This slide presentation offers some visual examples of the evolution of decolonization efforts in American museums. It maps several shifts from master narratives to deconstructed narratives, from curator-controlled presentations to a more inclusive and collaborative process with Native people actively involved in determining exhibition content. It is now commonplace and expected that museum professionals will seek the input of contemporary communities when developing exhibitions focused on American Indian content. And when it doesn't happen, there's trouble. 10 years ago, History Colorado had to dismantle and revise an exhibit on the Sand Creek Massacre when Native groups who had not been involved in the curatorial process objected to the representation. Protests have happened annually outside of the National Museum of Natural History in observance of Indigenous Peoples Day and in protest of Columbus Day. And recent protests have also called for the removal of the statue of Theodore Roosevelt outside the entrance to the museum. Master narratives such as Manifest Destiny are revised and interrogated using existing or prior installations. This revision of the old New York diorama at the National Museum of Natural History, for instance, rather than remove the former installation, has installed interrogative overlay that points out inaccuracies to visitors and asks them to question both what they are seeing and the inherited knowledge and understandings that are at its foundation. So on the one hand, we see a critique of the representation of Native versus European technology, and then also, in this case, an interrogative label that indicates that the representation of women and their position in Lenape society in this particular diorama is inaccurate. Related to this, museums have transformed their exhibition strategies, revising their collections with new thematic frames and from different perspectives. Some of the core exhibition moves involved in this decolonization strategy trace their origins back to the work of Fred Wilson in Mining the Museum, an installation at the Contemporary and the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore in 1992 and 1993. Working with objects in the collection of the Maryland Historical Society, text, spotlights, recorded texts, and objects traditionally consigned to storage were used by Wilson to draw attention to the local histories of Blacks and Native Americans, effectively unmaking the familiar museum narrative as a narrow ideological project. For instance, the exhibit greeted visitors with a silver-plated, century-old trophy for truth in advertising, emblazoned rather ridiculously with the word truth, prompting visitors to confront the terms absolutism. Which truth? Whose truth? Surrounding the trophy were 3 pedestals with busts of Napoleon, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson on one side, and 3 empty black pedestals representing Harriet Tubman, Benjamin Banneker, and Frederick Douglass, all black Marylanders, on the other. Wilson pressured the idea of a master narrative, pointing out its absences. In other galleries, Wilson unsettled the museum's comfortably white upper-class narrative by juxtaposing elegant silver vessels with slave shackles under the heading metalworking, and elegant 19th century armchairs with a whipping post. Cabinet making. In another gallery, modes of transport were displayed, and Wilson placed a baby buggy with a Klan hood replacing the baby's linen, with images of black nannies and white children nearby. The result of these juxtapositions was unsettling, especially given the eruption a mere week after the show opened of street violence in Los Angeles following the acquittal of 4 white officers accused of beating Rodney King. Visitation to the museum soared. Strategies of juxtaposition, recontextualization, and intervention remain powerful ways of bringing images and artifacts into dialogue with one another and disrupting traditional historic narratives. The Field Museum, one of the primary offenders of the colonizing impulse in terms of Indian culture, has recently undertaken the redesign of its Native American Hall, largely unchanged since the 1950s. The renovated hall, slated to open in late 2021, is representative of efforts on the museum's part to engage with Chicago's Native community and to better represent their stories. It's not just a new exhibition, it represents a whole new way of thinking, says curator of North American anthropology, Alaka Wali. In concert with this redesign, the museum has hired indigenous curators and staff and begun recontextualizing its installations with contemporary Native artists. One such installation was Drawing on Tradition, Kansa artist Chris Pappan. Pappan is an American Indian artist of Osage, Ka, Cheyenne River Sioux, and mixed European heritage. His art reflects the dominant culture's distorted perceptions of Native people while proclaiming that we are still here. As a co-curator, Pappan spent time researching the museum, in particular examining its Plains ledger art. In the 19th century, during forced relocation following the Indian Removal Act of 1830, pictorial narrative art formerly produced on hide was sketched on paper ledgers, and Pappan reinterprets this traditional art, laying graphite illustrations over found antique ledger paper, sometimes collaged with maps. And in these drawings, he distorts or mirrors portraits of historical figures. So here we have Red Owl's Sacrifice. Some of the transparencies overlaid on the galleries allow visitors to see through them to the encased objects, and others are opaque. Circling the display of taxidermy of an American bison is a strip that depicts a buffalo photographed by Edward Muybridge, galloping on maps of the Southwest, reminding the visitor that the landscape was once home to many of these animals, alive and running. Each of these art interventions recontextualizes the Field Museum collections, honoring the importance of the original objects, but drawing attention to the often limited ways they've been presented. And the Native North American Hall at the Field Museum is now undergoing reconstruction, and the project is led by an advisory committee of indigenous scholars and museum professionals. Encased objects will be properly conserved, and the hall will showcase material both from the museum's collections alongside contemporary objects co-curated with community members and Native American scholars. Notably, the museum also hosted a ceremony last October to recognize that it stands on the homelands of the Ojibwe, Adawa, and Potawatomi, the acknowledgement marked by a new plaque in its garden. The field redesign gestures towards the next shift in decolonization, which is one toward curatorial processes that involve Native communities as decision-making team members. One of the most significant features of these two types of exhibits, especially the community-based model, is the desire to move away from object-based presentations that focus on the functions and uses of objects according to ethnographic categories, which would be traditional museum knowledge systems. Instead, the exhibits make a stronger connection to the relationship that pieces have to contemporary communities, indigenous ways of knowing. The community is given final authority in all decisions related to the exhibit, from the themes and objects that will be featured to the design of the actual exhibit itself. And this results in some really powerful decolonizations of indigenous culture and knowledge and a re-representation of those, even in traditional museums. A great example is the Abbey Museum, located in Bar Harbor, Maine, which centers indigenous people in their own histories, stories, and futures, correcting harmful representations of the past. The Abbey Museum was first founded in 1926 and opened to the public in 1928. It was named for its founder, Dr. Robert Abbey, an eminent New York physician known for his pioneering use of radiation therapy. Dr. Abbey assembled a collection of early Native American artifacts found in the Frenchman Bay area, and the Abbey is particularly known for its collection of basketry. And he persuaded others with similar collections to join him in establishing the museum. In recent years, and just on this slide, I should note that this is a quote from the Abbey Museum's website that on the first page acknowledges that the museum is located on indigenous land, specifically the land of the Wabanaki. In recent years, the Abbey has grown from a small museum privately operated within Acadia National Park to a larger contemporary museum and a Smithsonian affiliate in the state of Maine. It's also recently been added to the International Sites of Conscience. The history and cultures of the native people in Maine, the Wabanaki, are showcased through changing exhibits, special events, teacher workshops, archaeology, field schools, and workshops for children. The Abbey's collections now represent 12,000 years of Native American culture and history in Maine, and its conservation program has actually been nationally recognized as a model. The educational role has expanded, and small exhibits on subjects such as basket making and the museum's founding complement the original archaeological collections. The museum began collaborating with Native peoples during the 1980s and 1990s, mounting exhibitions on themes such as the birch bark art of Toma Joseph, the role of Wabanaki basket makers in the local tourist economy. In recent decades, Native Americans have become increasingly involved in all aspects of the museum. The current director and curator of education are both members of indigenous nations, and also policymakers and members of the board of trustees are also from indigenous nations as well. People of the First Light, the Abbey's core exhibit, introduces visitors to the Wabanaki universe, engaging them with the culture and history of a people that may be unfamiliar. The exhibit brings together oral traditions, personal stories, cultural knowledge, and historical accounts to cover 12,000 years of history, conflict, adaptation, and survivance in the Wabanaki homeland. Objects, photographs, multimedia, and digital interactives also are showcased in the exhibit. And the design of the exhibit space was developed with a contemporary feel shaped by the work of Wabanaki artists who have been part of the design process from the beginning. The centerpiece is a 2-story sculptural ash tree that draws the various sections of the exhibit together. The exhibit also features artwork and illustrations by Maliseet artist Gina Brooks, among other Wabanaki artists. The Abbey represents the profound transformation that could be made when a formally colonizing institution seriously undertakes to return self-determination and control to Native peoples and make them central in the representation of their own culture and history. The community collaborative model is also writ large in the National Museum of the American Indian, which opened in 2004. The museum was established in 1989 through an act of Congress, a bill introduced by Senator Daniel Inouye, recognizing that the Smithsonian Institution held more than 12,000 to 18,000 Indian remains, mostly in storage. The museum was designed to be an institution of living cultures dedicated to advancing knowledge and understanding of the life, languages, literature, history, and arts of the native people of the Western Hemisphere. I visited the museum in 2015, and the following pictures of uneven quality are all my own. In the National Museum of the American Indian, every aspect of the museum contains embedded Native American understandings. So the design itself was meant to mimic the natural environment using natural limestone in a circular um, design. And the design of the building was specifically undertaken by a team of Native American architects. The grounds surrounding the museum also gesture towards Native American relationship with nature. They represent a specific deciduous forest, which is an important natural environment, and the whole shape of the grounds include native plants. The landscaping was done by a Native American landscaper, and the position of the building on the landscape facing east also resonates with the four directions of most Native American worldviews. Inside, we enter a large circular space, which has also a window on the ceiling, and we see the movement of the sun around the circular floor. This is a very high ceilinged ceremonial space, which is often used for cultural performances. And all of these performances are mounted in extensive consultation with Native peoples. Native docents are scattered throughout the museum, offering regular interactive sessions with visitors. And everybody's name tag has their name and also their tribal affiliation on it. Programs are presented by a wide variety of contemporary culture bearers from a wide variety of tribal groups in North America. So, for instance, we have the Cherokee National Youth Choir, which was performing that day at 1 p.m. The exhibits center on several subjects. One section, Our Peoples, reviews the different tribal groups and their interactions with their specific environments in North America. At the beginning of this gallery space talks about evidence. We are the evidence, it proclaims. And you'll notice the voicing is always in first person indigenous. So our peoples, we are the evidence. Here we have the Pamunkey Indian tribe in the Chesapeake, and there's a little interactive station where you travel like a boat along the river. Every single one of these sections was made in partnership with curators from that tribal group, and they are not just called community advisors, they're called curators. There's an extensive use of video and multimedia, interviews with particular tribal members talking about the specific cultural skills or knowledge bases, as well as other kinds of cultural traditions. There's also a section that focuses on Native American worldview called Our Universes, which takes us through, I think it's maybe 6 or 7 different tribal worldviews, including the Lakota and then the Anishinaabe. Again, focusing on the 4 cardinal directions and colors, and also some of the traditional values that are associated with specific tribal groups. There's also extensive gallery space devoted to history, both the history of colonization and genocide by European invaders. So there's a number of different exhibits, cases that cover specific interactions between tribal groups and the U.S. government, talking about treaties, treaty violations, massacres, and other sorts of violent acts of colonization. There's also an interesting section called Making History, which makes extensive use of oral tradition and oral history. So here the narration begins. This is about history and about the past. 2 different things. I think Truo would like that. And so we have Native narrators discussing the history. And what's interesting also about this section is that it frames history not only as chronological events of interactions with U.S. government and so forth, but also situates a lot of the different narratives within larger mythic narratives as well, emphasizing the circular nature of time in Native American worldview. And finally, the museum is very explicitly representing Native American cultures as living cultures in the modern world. We do not see Indians represented as some dead civilization from the past, but rather a whole section focuses on ways in which indigenous communities are adapting and maintaining their cultural traditions and languages within a contemporary context, including one here introducing the native curators of the multi-tribal communities in Chicago. Now, the National Museum of the American Indian, for all of its extensive collaboration with Native groups, has also come under a critique. Amy Lone Tree, in particular, has advanced a critique of the museum while stressing the important collaborative methodology. She also argues that the historic exhibitions fail to present a clear and coherent understanding of colonialism and its ongoing effects. So we get a lot of history in the Our People's Gallery, but she says it conflates an indigenous understanding of history with a postmodernist presentation of history and fails to tell what she calls the hard truths of colonization, as well as the genocidal acts committed against indigenous people. Other critiques of the museum suggest that the multitude of different tribal representations and voices in the museum is overwhelming, possibly incoherent, and doesn't necessarily give non-native visitors a coherent storyline to latch onto. I found the museum very interesting, that even the internal gallery spaces are designed in ways that resonate with Native American worldview. And while much of this may fall beneath the kind of level of consciousness of the average visitor, it certainly seemed to indicate the role of the Native curators in the design process. So Lone Tree concludes that the National Museum of the American Indian, as its name suggests, is ultimately still an institution of the nation state. And she says she really cautions against referring to the state as a tribal museum writ large, or even as a decolonizing museum. That distinction she reserves for the many Native American museums and cultural centers that have been founded since the American Indian movement of the 1960s. These museums are hybrid embodiments of Native and non-Native perspectives, using Western museum exhibition techniques to preserve and teach indigenous knowledge. One example you read about is the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan's Zebuwing Center of the Anishinaabe Culture and Lifeways, which opened in 2004. It represents the culture and history of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan, which is combined of three bands of Ojibwe, Saginaw, Black River, and Swan Creek, who live primarily in the eastern region of what is now Michigan. This tribe was subject to dispossession over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, losing land to multiple entities, including logging enterprises. In 1937, the tribal group acquired 500 acres of their current land, and it is this location which is the site not only of casinos run by the tribal group, but also of the Zebuwing Center. The Zebuwing Center honors the ancestors and recognizes the odds against which they protected and passed down the cultural knowledge, language, and teachings of the people. It is one of the more innovative tribal museums in the country, hosting programs of oral history and narration by indigenous peoples, shown below, as well as representing in more traditional museum ways the history and lifeways of the Anishinaabe people. The museum advances a decolonizing agenda and framing the entire exhibition within the context of the Anishinaabe oral tradition. And it represents the hard truths of colonization in its exhibitions with the aim of addressing legacies of unresolved grief. The present tribal involvement in the exhibit development demonstrates the links between self-representation and larger movements of Native American self-determination and cultural sovereignty. The center mounts thematic rather than object-based exhibits and effectively uses multimedia and storytelling and the first person voice. And most significantly, for someone like Amy Laundrie, emphasis on the Anishinaabe survival within a colonial context. Telling a story of survivance and healing, the center is an important site of knowledge making and remembering.